preach here today. I'm always glad to be with Wilson and Julie, and I'm especially glad to be with the congregation here. I know a number of you from past experiences. The Bunting family has always been very near and dear to my heart. In fact, I stand in awe of the amount of years, the labor, the toil that they put into the work in Norway. And it's a pleasure to be with Terrell and Karen, see Heath and Renee again. We spent 5 weeks living in their home in Bergen the last time I was over there. And Heath and I studied the book of Romans every day. I don't know if he knows anything about it yet, but we worked on it. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you. I thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you, and I hope that it will not be too unpleasant for you as you listen to my raspy voice. You know, when you became a Christian, you entered a very special relationship with God. But you also entered a very special relationship with the people of God. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. 30-some times in the New Testament, there are passages that use the expression one another. And we can't talk about all of them in a sermon of any reasonable length. But I want to talk to you about some of the one another passages in the New Testament. Let's get right to work now. In John 13, verses 34 and 35, Jesus said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." When Jesus said, a new commandment I give unto you, it's not to be thought that love had never been taught before Jesus came. In fact, the Old Testament talked about love. In Matthew 22, verses 27 to 30, they asked Jesus, "What is the first and great commandment in the law?" And he said, "The first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul." And he said, "The second is like it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So law was taught in the Old Testament, or love, rather, was taught in the Old Testament. That was not new when Jesus came. Well, what was new about it? He said, "A new commandment I give you." What was new was the nature or the quality of that love. He said, "I want you to love one another as I have loved you." Heath at the Lord's table a while ago talked about the extent of the love that Jesus manifested for us. In Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verse 5 beginning, Paul said, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient, even unto the death of the cross." When you think about the cross and all that was involved in the suffering, the agony through which our Lord passed, then you understand something about the nature, the quality of the love that Jesus had. There never has been a demonstration of love like that. And Jesus said, "I want you to love each other in the same sacrificial way that I have loved you." But let's change the subject now. Let's go to Galatians, the 6th chapter, and verse 2. Paul said, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Now, down in verse 5 of that chapter, he said, "Let every man bear his own burdens." Do we have a conflict here, you suppose? No. There are some responsibilities that are mine alone. They're not yours, they're mine. In 1 Timothy 5 and 8, Paul said, "If a man does not provide for his own, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." That's a duty that each man has, to provide for his own family. I can't shift that onto you. That's not your duty, that's mine. There are other responsibilities in life that we have to personally attend to, and we cannot shift them onto someone else. But back in verse 2, when he said, bear one another's burdens, there are some things in life that we can share with each other. You don't have to look very far to find people who have burdens. Right here in this congregation, I'm sure there's some of you who have had loved ones to go through agonizing diseases and problems, and you've had to spend a lot of time taking care of them. Burden, yes. It's a delight. I had to take care of my wife the last 2 years she lived, and I don't regret a single moment of that time taking care of her. But sometimes the responsibilities that we have in caring for those that need help is hard for us. And so there are things that you can do and I can do to help one another. Have you visited anybody in a nursing home lately? I visited many nursing homes. And sometimes you're on the way down the hall to see someone that you've gone there to see, and there are people sitting in wheelchairs out in the hall, and they want to start a conversation with you. They don't know you, and we don't know them, but they want somebody to acknowledge their existence. There are people there who have very few people to ever come to see them. I've talked to some of the people who work in nursing homes, and they tell me that we have people that never have any company. Nobody ever comes to see them. There they sit in a room or in a chair in a hall and stare at the wall and wait to die. Could you spend a little of your time to visit a friend or a brother or a sister in a nursing home? And when you go, can you please not look at your watch like you're being imposed upon because you're spending that much time with them? Listen to them. Ask them questions. Talk to them about their lives and their past. Sometimes older people who are in nursing homes have a lot of wisdom, but it's bottled up. Nobody gets to hear it. Take some time, would you, to do that? There are people who have serious family problems. And that's not just out in the world, but in the church we have them. There are people who go through traumas with their children. There are children who become rebellious, and they break their parents' hearts. They get into situations that we don't really know how to resolve and have to get help sometimes. There are people who go through divorces. That's a tragic time. There are people who have all sorts of problems that they face in life. Sometimes it's economic. Sometimes people lose a job that they've had for some time, and the company is bought out, and so you're dismissed. We have a lady at Hebron Lane where we worship in the Louisville area that worked for a company for many, many years. She's now 63 years old. Her company was bought out, and 2 years away from retirement age, she's out of a job. That creates a problem for people. There are people whose hearts are broken, and they need consolation. They need somebody just to talk to. Sometimes people need someone just to listen a little while to them. And so, bear one another's burdens. Is there a death in the congregation? Could you cook a casserole or get some Kentucky Fried Chicken or something and take over there to them and give them something to eat? You know, when you have a funeral, people come from kinfolks come, and they're there for a while. And they've got to eat while they're there. And the farthest thing from your mind when you've lost a loved one is cooking and providing for company. That's a good way to help bear some burdens with people. That's a very simple thing. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Let's change the subject again. In Romans the 15th chapter, in verse 7, Paul said, "Receive ye one another." And what's that about? Well, in the 14th chapter of Romans, Paul introduced two special areas of problems in the early church that we don't particularly have now, The principles apply now just as much as they did then. The first one had to do with eating meat. Meat, particularly that had been offered and sacrificed to idols. That was a problem with those coming out of a Gentile background or a Jewish background. But under the law of Moses, there were certain restrictions about what you could eat and what you couldn't. You couldn't eat pork. You couldn't eat you couldn't eat shellfish. You had fish that you ate had to have fins, according to the law. And so there were restrictions and limitations on that. It's my judgment that Romans 14 deals more with the Jewish aspect of this problem than anything else. Here are people who've come out of Judaism, they're Christians now. And they've never eaten some of these things at all. Now let's suppose a scenario, and you think about it a little bit. Here's a brother who's converted from Judaism. He's become a Christian now. He's in a congregation where there's some Gentiles, though, and there are people who don't have any problem about eating meat, whatever kind it is. And so one of these brothers invites this convert from Judaism to his house for dinner. And so he goes. He's glad to be included, to be a part of what's going on. And he goes over there, and guess what they have to eat? Pork chops. He looks at that, and he doesn't know whether he can eat that or not. He's never tasted it at all. Well, he doesn't want to offend his host. And his host looks at him, and he realizes that he's having a problem about it. So he says to him now, listen, we're Christians now. We're not under the law of Moses. It's just meat. It's all right to eat it. It's good. You like it. Well, he's persuaded. And so he puts some on his plate, cuts him off a bite of it, and puts it in his mouth. He chews it. The more he chews it, the bigger it gets. He's not sure he can even swallow it. What's the problem here? The problem is that this brother who understands that it's all right to eat meat is using his influence to pressure a brother who has a conscience problem about that. And he shouldn't violate his conscience, and you shouldn't try to persuade him to do so. We're to receive each other. Now let's suppose another scenario here. Let's talk about this same Jewish brother that's converted. He's never worked on Saturday in his life. One of the brothers has his barn burned down, and so there's going to be a barn raising out at his farm. And so on a Saturday, there's a bunch of brethren going out there to help him build his barn back. So he invites this converted Jewish brother to come and help him. But he's glad to be concluded, he wants to be a part. So he gets his hammer and his saw, and he goes out there on Saturday. And every time he drives a nail, it kills his conscience. Why? He never had worked on Saturday before. See? He's got a conscience problem. We all have scruples about various things. We've come out of different backgrounds. All of us have when we come into the church. And we bring baggage with us of different sorts. My father would not allow us to have playing cards, spot cards in our home. We didn't have them. We didn't have any at our house the whole time I was growing up. Now, he didn't think it was wrong to play rook. He thought that was all right. And old maids, he didn't have any problem with that. But he said these other cards were the tools of the gamblers. That was his conviction. I respected that. Lived by it. That was a conviction. We have Christians who have conscientious scruples about whether you can be a policeman or be in the military service. We have Christians who have scruples about whether or not a woman has to have an artificial covering on her head when she worships. And others don't share that conviction. And so when you've got a congregation with people with a mixture of these scruples, these convictions, how are we going to get along with each other? Well, what we're going to have to do is respect each other's consciences. That's what we're going to have to do. And that's why Paul said in Romans 15:7, wherefore receive one another, because God receives the brother who eats the meat and the brother who doesn't eat it. And God receives the brother who can work on Saturday and the one that can't. They're still brethren in Christ. And the strong brother is not to try to use his influence to over-persuade the weaker brother to violate his conscience. Now, could they talk about it? Could they study it? Well, of course. How in the world could a weak brother ever get to be a strong brother unless he's taught? Surely, it's good to study about it. But while you're doing that, respect the other fellow's conscience. Receive ye one another. Now let's change the subject again. This time let's talk about a passage in Ephesians 4, verses 31 and 32. Paul said, be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. We have three one another's in that passage. I want to talk about the first part of it, be kind one to another. We live in a world of angry voices. I've lived a right good while, and I've seen a lot of political situations arise, political conventions and elections. But I don't believe I have ever in my entire life seen the degree of rancor and the division, the hatred that exists between people of opposing political parties as we have in our country right now. I don't think I've ever seen the like of it. Be kind. Whatever happened to kindness anyhow? We need to apply it in our homes. Sometimes husbands and wives fuss and quarrel all the time, and home becomes a war zone instead of a retreat from the burdens and troubles of the world around us. Sometimes children don't know how to treat each other. They bicker and fuss and fight with one another. Whatever happened to kindness anyway? Sometimes we get in situations in traffic where our patience is sorely tested. You ever heard of road rage? You cut somebody off and they try to run you off in the ditch, or they pass you and they make an ugly gesture at you, or they yell at you. Sometimes people have been shot over that. There have been people killed over road rage. Whatever happened to be kind to one another? Are you courteous enough to let somebody else into the line of traffic when he's coming from a ramp onto the interstate? Could you slow up a little, blink your lights, and let him go on ahead of you? You got time to do that? I don't know what there is about men and automobiles, but something about putting a man behind the wheel of an automobile seems to empower him. He's in charge of something powerful now. And I tell you, this problem is not limited to folks out there in the world. Some of us have these problems. A good sister told me one time, or I heard her say that her husband, who was a preacher, was so kind that he'd hold the door open for everybody at the grocery store and then try to run over every one of them in the parking lot. Whatever happened, folks? Whatever happened to kindness? Sometimes if you have to flying, I used to enjoy it. It's kind of a chore right now. It's kind of a hassle. But you get to the airport and the flight that you're supposed to catch is delayed. And you have to wait and wait. Finally, the flight's canceled. And you can't get to the place you're supposed to get to catch another plane to go wherever you want to go. And so everybody's frustrated, and so you get up to the counter and you just take it out on whoever happens to be on duty that day. Or you get in the wrong line at Walmart. I'm good at that. If you ever see me in a line, don't get in the line behind me, because it's going to be, somebody will have to have a price check or something, and there you stand, shifting from one foot to the other. Hard to be patient. Don't take it out on the cashier. it's not his fault or her fault. Yeah? Be kind one to another. Brethren need to be kind with each other. You know, I'm sorry to say, I've been in a few business meetings where brethren weren't very nice to one another. Terrell, have you ever been in those? I have. I was embarrassed. There was a fellow that I'd studied with for some time, and finally he was converted to Christ, baptized into Christ. They announced on a Sunday that there was going to be a business meeting of the men. And he asked me, he said, Brother Adams, am I supposed to come to that meeting? I said, yes, you're one of the men here now. Well, we met, and he sat with me. And two of the older brothers got in the awfulest squabble you ever heard. It was totally unnecessary. And this young fellow looked at me and kind of bowed his head. Finally, he whispered to me, he said, Brother Adams, I don't think I'm ready for this. I said, I'm with you, brother. I'm not ready for it either. I was in one business meeting one time when I asked the fellow who was conducting the meeting, I said, can I say something? He said, please do. I said, let's pray. I'm not mad, so I'll lead the prayer. And when that was over, you could have heard a pin drop, and the rest of the meeting was peaceful. There's not any sense in that. There really isn't. Now, there are different things that vex us. Sometimes we don't feel good. And we just take it out on each other. Brethren, we can do better than that, can't we? Be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as Christ has forgiven you. Now, let's change the subject again. Let's go this time to 1 Peter 4 and verse 7. Where Peter said, use hospitality one to another without grumbling or without grudging. One translation says without grumbling. When you show hospitality to people, don't do it as if this is a burden on you to have to do that. Use hospitality to one another. Whatever happened to hospitality, you suppose? There was a time when people visited each other, and you didn't call ahead and let them know that you were going to come because they didn't have a telephone, or maybe you didn't either. That's the way I grew up. Sometimes you'd look through the corn rows out the kitchen window and see some lights flashing by, and they were coming to our house because there wasn't anywhere else to go up that road. And my mother would say, we've got company coming, you kids pick up. That meant straighten up the living room a little bit, we got company coming. When I was a kid, that was a highlight to have company to come and spend bedtime with you. And the old folks would talk, the kids would get out on the floor with big ears and big eyes and listen to them talk about funny things that had happened or strange things that had occurred, but it was entertainment. We didn't have television. And so that was entertainment, to have company to come. I remember during World War II, we weren't very far from Fort Lee, Virginia. And there were a number of young servicemen who came there just out of high school, some of them. And some of them were members of the church, and they attended in Hopewell where we did. And sometimes they brought some of their buddies with them, and we were able to convert some of them. But my family and some other families in the church made an agreement between themselves that they would never let a serviceman leave the premises without being invited home with somebody for dinner on Sunday. And my father would take us home, it was a carload of us, and take us home so my mother could get started with dinner. Then he'd go back to town and get a load of soldiers and bring them back to our house to spend the afternoon with us. And we met boys from everywhere. Some of them just out of high school. Some of them were homesick. Some of them were lovesick that left sweethearts behind. Some of them were frightened because they didn't know what was going to happen to them when they shipped out, whichever direction they had to go. It was a bad time for them, but a little hospitality sure did help them. And when the war was over, some of them came back to visit and to express their gratitude for the kindness that had been shown to them. Use hospitality one to another. If it had not been for the act of hospitality in the home where I grew up, I probably would not be standing here in front of you today as a preacher. When I was 14 years old, we had a meeting with a preacher who came to stay for 10 days. It was a 10-day meeting. We didn't used to have bobtail meetings like we have now, you know. You chop them off 2 or 3 days. This was a 10-day meeting. And there was a business meeting, and it lasted a long time. When my dad came out, my mother said, "It's kind of a long meeting." He said, "Yeah." Said, "Brother Stocks is coming for a meeting," and said, we were trying to decide who's going to keep him. My mother said, "Who is?" My dad said, "We are." My mother said, "We are." She said, "Have you lost your bathroom?" We don't even have a bathroom in the house. We didn't have running water. She said, "How's a man going to take a bath?" You know, men are problem solvers. My dad said, "Well, he'd give him a number 2 wash tub and put some water in it, and he can sit down in it like we do." She said, "I don't have enough dishes that match to set a good table." He said, "You got 2 sisters and they got lots of dishes. You can borrow some from them." See the problem? He was a problem solver. Well, the deal had been struck. My dad had volunteered, and stay with us he did. And it was a wonderful 10 days. We were all enamored of this visitor in our home. He'd been to places that we'd never been and never dreamed of going. He'd met a lot of interesting people. When he went to Washington to work, before he became a full-time preacher, he was the secretary for Senator J.C. Rankin from the state of Mississippi. And he went to Washington to serve in that capacity. But he also began to preach some, and he got so good at it that the brethren prevailed on him to leave his government job and just preach. And he did. And he was a good preacher. Well, while he was there with us, he went to town one day. He had to have his car serviced. And he asked me, he said, "Cornelius," don't you call me that, but my front name is Connie, and I didn't get to vote on it. But he said, "Cornelius," said, I'm going to town to get some things done to my car. I said, "How about riding over there with me?" My mother said it'd be all right if he didn't care. On the way over there, he said to me, "Cornelius, what are you going to do when you grow up?" Well, I said, "My brother and I are going to go to Nashville, Tennessee and play on the Grand Ole Opry." We had a band and we played music. And that was our dream. That's what we intended to do. He said, "Well, that sounds like fun, but did you ever think about being a preacher?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't think I could do that. I wouldn't know what to say." He said, is it embarrassing for you or hard for you to get up in front of people and sing and play?" And I said, "No, I kind of like it." He said, "See there, you've got stage fright whipped already. You don't have to worry about that." But he didn't say any more till we started home. He said, "You know, Cornelius, I've got some notes I've typed up about the history of the church. And it got some material in there about where all the different denominational churches started, how they got started." He said, "One of these days you could use some of that." Said, "While I'm here, you could copy those if you'd like to do that." But we got home and I got some paper and a pen and sat down at the kitchen table. And my mother said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Brother Stocks has some notes here on church about how the churches all got started, and I'm copying them down. I still have them." I'll tell you what happened when he asked me that question. You ever think about being a gospel preacher? He turned my world upside down. I didn't realize it at the time. But you know what he did? He planted a seed in my heart. And I haven't been able to get rid of it since. Here I am. I don't know how many times I've stayed in homes where there were some 12 or 14-year-old boys, and I nearly always ask them, when am I going to get to hear you preach? I bet you could do it. And you never know. You never know what will grow from that seed. Use hospitality one to another. You don't have to have a lot of fancy things to feed people, to invite them to your home. Get the peanut butter and crackers out and Kool-Aid. If that's all you have to drink, that's fine. Just spend some time with each other. You don't have to have something real fancy to invite people over to your place. And there are other ways to show hospitality, of course. Congregations need to show hospitality when visitors come. You know, when we meet together, it's natural for us when service is over to get with somebody that we know well and start talking a little while. And we need to be very attentive to those who visit among us. Have you ever been a stranger in a congregation where you've never been before? And you walk in and nobody knows you, and you don't know them. Wouldn't it be nice for people to come around and shake your hand and tell them who you are and ask about them and their family and where they're from and where they're going and so forth? Strike up, show some hospitality. Congregations need to do that too. We need to be friendly with people that visit among us. Make them feel warm and welcome and want to come back again. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. Now let's change the subject one more time. In Hebrews, the 10th chapter, in verse 24, the writer said, consider one another to provoke unto love and good works. We're supposed to provoke one another. Yes, that doesn't mean we need to make each other angry, but it means to stir up. Stir up one another. Encourage one another to love and good works. And in that same context, after saying that, he said, not forsaking, verse 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. One thing that we do to consider one another is to worship together. When the church meets, you need to be present. Each one of us does. What good does it do? Well, it helps each other. We sing together. Colossians 3:16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. See, when we sing, we're praising God, but that's not all we're doing. We're lifting each other up. We're stirring one another up to think about sacred things. And that's so important to do that. When the church meets and your seat is empty, you're missed. I've held a good many gospel meetings in my life, and I've been to places where the brethren would be prepared and the house would be full every service. I've been to other places where you'd have a large crowd on Sunday morning, about half that many back Sunday night, and about a third of them in the weeknights through the meeting through a week. And sometimes if it were not for visitors coming from other places, it would be embarrassing. What happened? What about that? When the congregation comes together to meet, if you're a member of the congregation church, you need to take advantage of every opportunity you have to worship the Lord with your brethren, to encourage one another, have time to exchange some conversation with each other when we come together. Consider one another to stir up to love and good works. Sometimes we have new converts, and they've got a long ways to go. We just recently converted a brother who's 74 years old. He's come out of a denominational background, and everybody is taken him right in, and he's a part of everything. I don't think he's missed a service since he was baptized, except one, and that's when he drove me up to Smedley, Indiana to preach one Sunday. But the brethren have encouraged him, and that's what we need. We need to encourage one another to do what's right. Sometimes our brethren who are weak, and they need companionship. If you're going out to visit somebody that needs visiting, take one of them with you and let them see what's involved in trying to reason with people about the need to be faithful. There's so many things we can do to encourage and stir up one another. One another. May the Lord help us to appreciate the responsibilities that we have, not only to God, but to God's people as well. And I want to thank you for listening to what I had to say. Would you get your hymn books and open to the song that's been chosen for the invitation? What was the number? 337. All right, everybody hear that? We're going to be standing in just a moment to sing this song. And as we do this, this is not just a matter of ritual that we do this. This is a matter of an earnest and sincere effort on our part to prevail on you, if you're not a Christian, to be one. We love you and we're concerned about you. Jesus loved you and died for you. God loved you and so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. This is a wonderful time for you to become a Christian if you're not one. And we sing this song not just as a routine, but we sing this song as a sincere effort to encourage you to think about where you stand with God. I've made arrangements for my funeral, what I want sung. And I've decided that I want all invitation songs sung at my funeral. That's all I want sung. Because I want people to leave there thinking that somebody was concerned about their soul and they need to think about where they stand with God. If you need to obey the gospel today and confess your faith in Christ, we'll be glad to hear it. The angels of heaven will rejoice, and then we'll baptize you into Christ for the remission of your sins. If you need to do that, why don't you do that today? If you've started serving the Lord and you've drifted away, you've become unfaithful, you need to come home, make it right. The brethren will encourage you here. They'll give you a shoulder to lean on. They'll offer all kinds of support and help for you. If you just do that which is right, come home. While we stand together and sing, would you make your way to one of the aisles and right down to the front? Let's sing now.